lots of friends in San Jose.
Joining us now, senior Washington correspondent at the Wall Street Journal, Jake Schlesinger. He's out with a new piece entitled "Nobody Has to Be Punished: Joe Biden's Economic Tap Dance." Tell us more about it. What's the dance?
Morning, Mika. Basically, what the story lays out that I did with my colleague Ken Thomas is that in contrast with Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders, who in some ways get a lot more attention for their big ideas, big structural change, call for political revolution, Biden is trying to, in some ways, tap into the progressive energy that both Sanders and Warren clearly have exercised and energized, but also, still preserving his appeal to the middle, partly because he believes and his people believe that that's an important, perhaps a more important constituency, and also making a virtue of necessity, which is that as a senator, as a former vice president, he's hardly someone who's going to make a break with the establishment and the recent history of Democratic economic policy the way Sanders and Warren can.
Jason Johnson has a question. Jason?
Yeah, so Jacob, what's interesting about this, and I understand this notion of a tap dance, especially during the primary season, but is there any historical precedent for this? When I look back over the last 30 or 40 years of presidential campaigns, I've never seen the guy who says stay the course end up winning the primary, let alone end up winning the general election. So how do Biden's people think that slow and steady is going to win in a race against a president who offered radical change and is delivering it, whether or not we even agree with it?
Well, I guess I'd say a couple of things. I mean, one is, as you well know, Biden's appeal politically is very much that the radical change we've had is too radical. And so perhaps when you're looking for precedent, you go back to, Warren Harding and a return to normalcy, not to suggest that Joe Biden is a Warren Harding candidate. But, it is not unusual for a vice presidential candidate or vice president who's running for president to say, I'm essentially offering a third term, whether it was George Bush for Ronald Reagan, Al Gore for Bill Clinton, and, Hillary Clinton in a way for Barack Obama. And so, I think there is precedent for that, and I think the question is whether that's adequate to satisfy the base. And I think that the Biden calculation is in part that Trump has been so radical that people perhaps don't want quite as much radical. And I guess I'd say the other thing is, when you look at the ideas of a Senator Warren or Senator Sanders, without passing judgment on what's right or wrong, on a historical scale, they would push the envelope pretty far out there. And I think the question is whether that is too far even for most Democrats, and that's the Biden calculation.
Kurt Bardella.
Jacob, we haven't really seen this conflict come to a head yet in terms of how the other main candidates, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, are positioning themselves to juxtapose with Biden. I'm wondering if you think as this campaign goes on and we see Biden try to make this tap dance, we're seeing in the decisions he's making and how he spends his time. Good example, this week he's instead going to be going to Illinois to do a big fundraiser rather than participate in a climate forum here in D.C. that MSNBC is going to be sponsoring. Do you expect that Sanders and Warren are at some point going to highlight that, Biden's really trying to have it both ways, and that's not going to work?
That's a really good point, Kurt, which is that we haven't actually seen direct engagement between these two wings yet. You saw it flare up a little bit in last week's debate at the very beginning on the question of fiscal policy and spending, where the question was put directly to Biden as to whether he thought his main rivals were too liberal. He didn't answer it directly, but then went on to attack their big spending ways and to contrast his focus that he says more on things should be paid for. So far, Elizabeth Warren seems to have largely avoided taking on Biden. Bernie Sanders, at least his campaign less so. His campaign has been pretty explicit about going after Biden and some of his actions, including what you'd alluded to, which is his meetings with his holding fundraisers. But I think as this field narrows, and I think you were talking about that a little bit in the earlier segment, the contrast and the conflict is going to get a lot sharper.
The Wall Street Journal's Jake Schlesinger, thank you so much for being on the show this morning.
My
See
pleasure.
you soon. And still ahead, Mitch McConnell says the Senate is in a holding pattern on gun legislation, and Democrats are just not having it. We'll show you some of what they had to say to the Majority Leader and the Republican Party last night. Morning Joe is back in a moment.